Hey everyone, this is writing micro lesson number 4 on sentence structure for Honors 112 in the Civilization sequence of the Honors College at the University of Maine, and I'm the instructor, Rob Glover. So today we're going to talk about sentence structure. I'll turn first to why sentence structure is so important, and we'll talk about a lot of different dimensions of sentence structure, but these are the 3 things that I really want you to zero in on for this week's writing assignment. One is clarity. So sentence structure is going to impact how clear the points you're making in your writing are. The arguments, the evidence that you're integrating, all of that depends upon sentence structure. You can have the best information in the world. If you don't express it clearly, your reader isn't going to receive that information. Sentence structure also enables variety. So it is literally the way in which you introduce variation in your writing and change up how you present your information in ways that are going to engage your reader and sustain their interest. And it's also really important in relation to transition. So anytime you're moving from one idea to another, you've made one point, you're going to talk about another one, that can be jarring for the reader. And so sentence structure can kind of help smooth the path by which your reader is led from one point to another. So it's really important, and it's a skill that sometimes students struggle with. Sometimes really smart students struggle with it because you have so much that you want to say, and the sentence structure can end up jumbled as a result. So let's talk first of all about different types of sentences. All right, so there's something called clauses. Clauses are just groups of words with a subject and a predicate, and you can have an independent clause or a dependent clause. So an independent clause contains both a subject and a verb, and it could actually serve as a standalone sentence. So an example would be the man went to the store. A dependent clause contains a subject and a verb, but it can't be a standalone sentence on its own. It would be a sentence fragment. So an example would be, while I listen to music. You'd need something else there, right? What happens while you listen to music? If you just say, while I listen to music, that's an incomplete idea. So you'd need to supplement that with something else that tells the reader what's happening while you're engaged in that activity. So those are clauses, independent clauses, dependent clauses. Now, the ways in which we categorize sentences relate to how we configure those sentences with different combinations of clauses. So the simplest sentence that you can have is a simple sentence. It contains one independent clause. We went to the coffee shop. There's a subject, there's a predicate. That's a complete sentence. It conveys an idea, but it does so in a way that's pretty simple and kind of urgent. When you're using simple sentences, oftentimes you're doing so to convey the most important information, or there's something that you really want to convey in the most straightforward way possible. We can also talk about compound sentences. So this is going to combine 2 independent clauses, but it uses something called a conjunction or a semicolon. So a conjunction is just a word that links 2 independent clauses. The example here is we went to the coffee shop and we found it was empty. That and is linking 2 independent clauses. A lot of times students are confused about where to use semicolons. Now semicolons you can use essentially in place of a conjunction. So the proper use of a semicolon is to link 2 related but independent clauses. Here it's the same ideas, the same information is conveyed, but you're not using a conjunction, you're using a semicolon. We went to the coffee shop, semicolon, we found it was empty. So that's what we call a compound sentence. We also have something called a complex sentence. This contains one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. So, while we waited for our friends, we went to the coffee shop. When we discovered the library was closed, we went to the coffee shop that I had found on Yelp. That one actually contains multiple dependent clauses. So that's a more complex sentence structure. There's more there. Maybe that is necessary. Maybe there's multiple ideas that you want to convey in a single sentence, but you're moving to a more complex sentence structure that's going to require more attention for your reader, and it's going to read as less urgent, less immediate, which is fine. It's fine to have variation in your sentence structure, but just be mindful of the ways in which you move from one to another. This is a more complex sentence structure. And then we have the last kind, compound complex. This is going to contain 2 or more independent clauses and 1 or more dependent clauses. So an example would be, we went to the coffee shop that I had wanted to visit, and then we went to the library. Or, before we went to the library, we went to the coffee shop that I had wanted to visit, and we realized it was closed. Right? So you have combinations of independent and dependent clauses there. And this is probably the most complex type of sentence that you're going to use. So that's just a little bit about the different types of sentences. You've probably done this unconsciously. Maybe you're not aware of the specific names for these things, but if you've written any lengthy piece of writing, more sophisticated piece of writing, you're using different types of sentence structure. But there's actually a strategy to this. There's a strategy in how you choose which forms of sentences you're going to use, how you structure the words that you put on the page or on the screen. One good suggestion is you want variation. You don't want all simple, sentences that, just convey a subject and a predicate and are relatively simple in their construction, because that can read as choppy. It's kind of like staccato, if you're familiar with music. It's just bouncing from one idea to another, and it can read as sort of choppy. So ideally, you want to introduce some sort of variation. Use the complex and compound structures to convey as much info as possible in a single sentence. So if you have a sentence that's kind of setting up lots of important contextual information, it's okay to use compound sentences, complex sentences, to just get as much of that information through in a single sentence as possible. And you generally want to use those simpler sentence structures for emphasis, right? So if you have an incredibly important point, if your reader takes away nothing else from your writing, you want them to understand this one point. Maybe you want to put that in a very simple sentence, perhaps at the close of a paragraph or the beginning of a paragraph, so that it really jumps out at your reader. But be strategic in how you structure your sentences, and try to think about why you're choosing a certain form of sentence structure over another. So that's some general advice. We also have something called dependent markers, and these are the words that introduce a dependent clause. And this is a way that you can use certain terminology, certain words to introduce variation in your sentences. So these would be words like after, although, because, unless, whatever, whenever, whether. So these introduce variation. So here's an example that you might write from this week's reading from the New Testament. Although many were skeptical that Jesus was the Son of God, marginalized individuals immediately sensed his divine origins. So it's going to introduce variation. It's going to kind of lead your reader into the point that you're making, and it can be a good tool to move from one idea to another. So those are the words that introduce a dependent clause. We also have transitional words and phrases. And so these, again, are words that introduce variation. They vary the rhythm or the flow of your sentences, and they're also going to provide signposts for your readers. They kind of alert them to what's coming up. So these would be things like accordingly, earlier, even though, moreover, nevertheless. Now look at each one of those words and think about how you would use that in a sentence, right? So for example, nevertheless. You can imagine nevertheless if you're making a series of points, perhaps that challenge your overarching thesis statement, or they challenge the point that you're making in a specific paragraph. Some might say X, Y, and Z. Nevertheless, in light of all these things I've just presented, and then you make your statement. So that would be situating the point that you're making into maybe some evidence or some counter arguments that challenge that point. And each one of those words really functions in that way. On the whole, for example, could be a transitional word or phrase that you use to sum up some complex information and really drill it down, distill it down to its basic essence. So I've told you, 4 or 5 different things. On the whole, here's the summary. So here's an example. Regardless of the miracles that Jesus performed, many who came into contact with him still harbored doubt that he was the Messiah. So you can imagine that maybe coming at the end of a sentence, at the end of a paragraph rather, in which you've documented some of the different miracles that we encounter in the New Testament, and you close with, regardless of the miracles that Jesus performed, many who came into contact with him still harbored doubt that he was the Messiah. And that would actually lead you really well into a paragraph about the nature of that doubt, or specific examples of people who doubted or betrayed Jesus and the New Testament. So that's a tool, and I encourage you to think about transitional words and phrases and try to be intentional in how you use them in your writing. I also encourage you to use dynamic verbs, and this is probably the thing that I find myself commenting on most in students' writing. There's a very easy way to set up a sentence, and it looks something like the example that I have here. The problem with the societies to which Jesus is preaching is that they are too corrupt to receive his message. There's a very easy way to set up a sentence in which you're using a to-be verb, right? Is, was, were, those, some form of the verb to be. And frequently it's is. And sometimes I'll look through a student's paper, I'll even start highlighting the ways that they're using the verb is. And it's a simple sentence structure. It's easy. It's maybe a good way to initially get thoughts down on a page. The problem with that is it's not very interesting to read, right? There's all sorts of really dynamic and interesting verbs that you can use instead of to be. It's probably the simplest verb that you can use. And you can use dynamic, engaging verbs that just make your writing a lot more interesting to your reader. So this is an alternative way of expressing the exact same thing. The corruption of the societies in which Jesus was preaching renders them unable to receive his message. You notice that is doesn't appear anywhere there. And you have an interesting verb like renders, right? That in general is just what I encourage you to do. Even if you initially get a sentence down and you're using a to-be verb, go back. And sometimes you're stuck, and the to-be verb is the only one that will work. But I would say 9 times out of 10, there's a more interesting, engaging verb that you can use there. I'd also encourage you to avoid repetition in verb choice. So just read through your work after you've written it and see if you've maybe fallen into a situation in which you're using the same verb over and over, and try to think about variation there. Or just consult the thesaurus and try to use a synonym for that verb that breaks it up and changes the repetition a little bit. Lastly, active voice. Active voice versus passive voice. You've probably seen reference to this, maybe even if you've taken a writing class, they've talked about this a little bit. Passive voice isn't grammatically wrong, and there's situations in which you potentially would use passive voice. So here's an example, and I frequently see it as a tool that students use to avoid using I, to avoid using the first person. But this would be an example. It has been argued that, or it was found that. Oftentimes students, when they're framing their thesis statement in a paper, or laying out what they're going to argue in a research paper, they will say things like, it is the argument of this paper that, and that's passive voice, right? You're kind of disembodying the subject of that statement. The simplest way to state that would be, I will argue that, and use the first person. The way that you would take these specific examples and change them over to active voice is essentially to identify your subject, right? So it has been argued. Well, you could say the lecturer argued, or it was found that. You could say we found that, right? And you'd be using first person, but you'd also be avoiding the passive voice. I am perfectly okay with students using first person. If you want to use I, if you want to use we, that's okay. I think that this prohibition on the use of first person leads to weirdness in writing, and oftentimes tortured constructions when it is much easier just to use the first person. The passive voice is not grammatically wrong, as I said. It is not grammatically incorrect. It is a stylistic choice to use passive voice. But the problem that I have with passive voice, and what I see with passive voice when students use it, is that it can lead to unnecessarily complex language. You're using 7 words to say something instead of 2, or it leads to evasive language, right? So you take the example, it has been argued. You are avoiding identifying who has argued whatever has been argued. You are avoiding attaching an identity, assigning an identity to that action. Who is responsible for an idea? Who is responsible for an insight? Now, sometimes that makes sense if it is actually unclear who has argued that, or you're making some sort of broad generalization. But a lot of times that's just evasion, and it does not make things clearer for your reader, and actually introduces questions that maybe you don't resolve in your paper. So I really encourage you to, wherever you can, use active voice, and don't be bound by this prohibition against using first person if you find that is why you're using the passive voice and you're not simply saying, I will argue, or we talked about X, Y, or Z. So try to minimize that. You don't feel as if you have to completely eliminate passive voice, but at least be intentional when you're using it or not using it. All right, so that's kind of what I wanted to go over. In the assignment for this week, I would encourage you to go back to the very first thing I said here, and these are the grounds on which I'll be evaluating you. I'm looking for clarity. I'm looking for clear sentences. So look over each one of your sentences and make sure that you're being clear. I'm looking for variety. So I want to see you using different lengths of sentences, different types of sentence structure. And I'm also looking for transition. I don't want to see, ideally I don't want to see jarring, moves from one idea to another without some sort of transition. So think about how you can use some of that transition, the transitional language or transitional phrases to kind of lead your reader along from point to point, as opposed to just jumping from point to point. And try to get into that habit in your writing generally is, how can I provide some transition here to make the flow more consistent from idea to idea. And that's what I'll be evaluating you on. So I look forward to reading what you write for this week, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions or run into any issues. Thanks very much.